I've been going back and forth on whether I should even put this into words, because the more I think about it, the less it makes sense, and the more it feels like I'm trying to explain something that doesn't want to be explained. But if I don't write it down somewhere, then everything that happened out here just ends with us. And I don't think that's something I can live with, assuming I make it back at all. For context, I'm part of a 6-person crew assigned to a long duration mission aboard a deep space research vessel. It wasn't anything flashy or experimental from what we were told, just routine data collection, system monitoring, and a lot of empty space between scheduled tasks. By the time this started, we had already been out here for about 6 months, and the routine had settled into something almost mechanical. You wake up, run checks, rotate duties, eat, talk, sleep, and then repeat it all over again until days stop feeling like separate things. When you live like that long enough, you start to notice people in a way you normally wouldn't. You pick up on habits, patterns, tiny details in how they move or speak, and without realizing it, you build this mental baseline of who everyone is. At the time, it just felt like boredom filling in the gaps. Looking back now, I think that familiarity is the only reason I realized something was wrong. There were 6 of us in total, and after months together, everyone had settled into their role not just professionally, but socially as well. Myra was our lead scientist, and she carried herself with this quiet confidence that made it seem like she was always a few steps of everyone else, even when she didn't say much. Holt, our engineer, was the opposite. Loud, sarcastic, constantly complaining about the ship, but somehow still the one who could fix anything when it actually mattered. Priya handled systems, and if something was even slightly off, she would notice it before anyone else had a chance to question it. Ortega was our pilot, and while he didn't talk much, there was something about the way he observed everything that made you trust his judgment without needing an explanation. Carter was our medical officer, and he had this habit of joking through situations that probably shouldn't have been funny, which worked until things stopped being manageable. And then there was me, somewhere in the middle of all that, responsible for coordination oversight and making sure the mission stayed on track, which in hindsight feels almost ironic. The first sign that something was off came from Ortega, and at the time, none of us treated it with the seriousness it probably deserved. He mentioned that he had seen someone standing in the observation deck, which by itself wasn't unusual, since people went there all the time to break the monotony. What made it strange, though, was the way he described it. He said the person was completely still, just standing there and looking out into space without reacting to anything around them. When he called out, there was no response, which he initially brushed off, assuming whoever it was just hadn't heard him. But as he got closer, he realized something that didn't make sense, and when the figure finally turned around, he saw his own face looking back at him. Not just similar, but identical, down to the smallest details. The same uniform, the same posture, even the same faint scar above his eyebrow. The only difference, according to him, was the expression. He said it looked like someone trying to imitate a reaction they didn't fully understand, like it had learned what a face should do, but not why. Naturally, we did what anyone would do in that situation and tried to find a logical explanation before jumping to anything else. We ran diagnostics on the observation deck, checked camera feeds, reviewed access logs, and scanned for any kind of anomaly that could explain what he saw. Everything came back clean. There was no second person recorded in that area, no unusual readings, and no indication that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. Carter suggested that it might have been a stress response, pointing out how isolation and repetition can affect perception over time. And while that explanation seemed reasonable on the surface, it didn't sit right with everyone. Priya, in particular, seemed uneasy, even if she didn't openly disagree. Holt, of course, turned it into a joke and spent the next couple of days asking Ortega if he had run into himself again, which might have been funny, if Ortega hadn't started taking it so seriously. Over the next few days, Ortega's behavior changed in a way that was hard to ignore. He stopped sleeping, claiming that every time he closed his eyes, he felt like something was watching him, and he began avoiding certain parts of the ship entirely, especially the observation deck. At first, we tried adjusting his schedule and reducing his workload, hoping that rest would help stabilize things, but nothing seemed to make a difference. Instead, he became more withdrawn, spending long periods sitting in common areas and staring down hallways as if he expected something to appear at any moment. Then one morning, he simply wasn't there. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that he had left voluntarily, and no missing equipment that would suggest he had gone outside. We searched the entire ship, including sealed sections that hadn't been opened in months, but it was as if he had vanished without a trace. A few days after Ortega disappeared, I had my own experience, and even now, I still question whether I would have believed it if I hadn't seen it for myself. I was moving through one of the main corridors when I noticed someone standing at the far end, partially obscured by the dim lighting. At first, I assumed it was one of the others, but something about the way they were standing felt wrong. Too still, too deliberate. Like they were waiting rather than just being there. As I got closer, the figure became clearer, and that's when I realized it was Ortega. He didn't look injured or disoriented, and for a brief moment, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief, thinking that somehow he had been found. But that feeling didn't last, because as soon as I spoke his name, he tilted his head slightly and smiled in a way that didn't match anything I had ever seen from him before. It wasn't relief or recognition or even confusion. It was something else entirely. Something that felt practiced rather than genuine. Before I could react, the lights flickered and went out for just a second, and when they came back on, the corridor was empty again. After that, things escalated quickly, and whatever sense of normalcy we had left started to unravel. Priya began finding inconsistencies in system logs, including recorded activity in rooms that were supposed to be sealed, and commands being executed by crew members who were confirmed to be elsewhere at the time. Carter reported hearing voices in the medbay when no one else was present, describing them as familiar but distorted, like someone speaking through a version of a person rather than the person themselves. Holt started securing his tools after noticing that items would go missing and then reappear in places he hadn't left them. Through all of this, Myra remained unusually composed, continuing to insist that everything was operating within expected parameters, which only made the situation feel more controlled than chaotic. Eventually, I accessed restricted files that we weren't supposed to review under normal circumstances, and what I found made it clear that this wasn't an accident or a malfunction. The mission wasn't just research, it was observation. There was something else on board with us, something classified simply as an entity, with documentation describing its ability to mimic behavior, adapt over time, and eventually replace individuals entirely. One line in particular stood out. Successful integration depends on prolonged exposure and reduced suspicion among subjects. After that, trust between the crew broke down completely, and we started isolating ourselves in separate sections of the ship, limiting interaction and questioning every piece of communication we received. Even simple conversations began to feel uncertain, because there was no way to confirm whether the person on the other side was who they claimed to be. Holt was the first to act on instinct rather than caution, insisting that he heard Carter calling for help from the hallway outside his section. Despite our warnings, he opened the door, and we watched through the security feed as he stepped out and immediately froze in place. Standing in front of him was another version of himself, identical in every visible way, and within seconds, both of them were speaking at once, each accusing the other of being the imitation. The feed cut out briefly, and when it came back, both of them walked back into the room together, still arguing, still indistinguishable. That was the last time we saw Holt, or Carter for that matter, and since then, it's just been me and Myra left on opposite sides of the ship. At least, that's what I've been telling myself. Right now, she's sitting across from me while I record this, watching in complete silence with the same calm expression she's had since the beginning. And I can't shake the feeling that she already knows everything I'm about to say before I even say it. The longer I sit here, the harder it becomes to hold on to the idea that I'm still thinking clearly. Because if something can copy a person down to every detail, every memory, every habit, then there's no real way to prove that you're still the original. And that's the part that keeps coming back to me, no matter how much I try to ignore it. If it learned from us, if it replaced us, then at what point would I have stopped being me and not even realized it?